I found my father's journal 3 weeks after we buried him, wedged behind the false bottom of his study desk, wrapped in a cloth that smelled of camphor and old fear. I recognized the handwriting immediately, that cramped, deliberate script he used when he didn't want anyone to read what he was putting down, and I made the mistake of reading the first line while standing in that cold room alone. And after that, I couldn't stop. The journal described a period from 1987, when I was 4 years old and my mother was still alive, and we lived in the house on Sycamore Lane that my father sold 3 months after she died. I had no memory of that house. I had no memory of what the journal described, but my body did. I know that now. I know it because of the way my hands started shaking before I'd read past the second page, the way my throat closed around nothing, the way some animal part of me recognized what my conscious mind was only beginning to process. My father wrote about sounds. That was how it began. He described waking at 3 or 4 in the morning to a noise from the room at the end of the hall, the room we used for storage. The room that had no window and a door that swelled in winter so that it had to be forced open with a shoulder. He described the noise as rhythmic and low, something between a hum and a grinding. And he wrote that the first time he heard it, he assumed it was pipes, the old heating system, the settling of a house that had been built in the 40s and never properly maintained. He checked. It wasn't pipes. He wrote this without drama, which is what frightened me most about reading it, the flatness of his tone, the way a man records a grocery list or a weather observation. And I understood that by the time he was writing this down, he had already passed through whatever initial terror might have softened his language. He had come out the other side of shock and arrived somewhere colder. The second week, he wrote, the sounds changed. They became more specific. He started to hear what he could only describe as weight shifting, the sound of something redistributing itself across a floor. Slow and deliberate, the way a sleeping animal adjusts in the night. He wrote that he stood outside the storage room door for 11 minutes one night, his hand on the knob, and could not make himself open it. He wrote that, as a confession, I think. My father was not a man who admitted to being unable to do things. He held that as a point of pride, so foundational that the family had organized itself around it for 30 years. And to read those words in his handwriting, I could not make myself open it. It was like watching a load-bearing wall crack straight down the center. After that, he wrote about me. He wrote about finding me in the hallway at night, standing outside that same door, not crying, not moving, simply standing and looking at the door the way very young children sometimes look at things that adults have long since trained themselves not to see. He said he picked me up both times and carried me back to my room, and I didn't resist and didn't speak, and fell back asleep immediately. And he wrote that what disturbed him most was not finding me there, but the expression on my face, which he described with 3 words and then crossed them out so thoroughly that the paper had worn thin. And whatever those 3 words were, I cannot recover them, and I have spent more nights than I will admit staring at that cross-hatched ink, trying to read through it. He took me to a doctor. He wrote about that. The doctor found nothing. Said I was a healthy 4-year-old exhibiting normal somnambulistic behavior. It's not uncommon in children. Nothing to worry about. My father thanked the doctor and drove home, and that night he pushed the heavy storage room door opened and went inside with a flashlight. He wrote 6 pages about what he found. The first 5 pages are a precise physical inventory of the room. Everything in it, every box and folded tarp and broken piece of furniture, written in exhaustive detail with measurements and positions. And I understood that he was stalling, building toward something. And I turned the pages with the particular dread of a person walking toward a sound they already know they should be walking away from. The 6th page was short. He wrote that in the corner behind a stack of boxes he found a cleared space on the floor, a rough circle approximately 4 feet in diameter. and that the floorboards inside this circle were scored with deep, parallel scratches running in one direction, like something had been dragged or something had pushed itself, repeatedly against the grain of the wood. He wrote that the scratches were fresh. He wrote that some of them were still bright inside, the pale would not yet oxidized. And he knelt down and touched them, and they were warm. That was the last entry for 11 days. When he resumed writing, his handwriting had changed. Not dramatically, not in a way that would be obvious to anyone who hadn't spent a lifetime reading his letters. But I had, and I could see it. The letters leaned differently. The pressure of the pen was uneven in a new way. And there was a quality of haste that had never been there before. As though he was writing quickly to get something down before he lost the nerve or before something interrupted him. He wrote that my mother had begun to behave differently. He was careful in how he put it. He wrote that she seemed distracted, that she lost track of conversations, that he would find her standing in rooms without knowing how she had gotten there or what she had been doing. He wrote that she had started going to the storage room, not secretly, not at night, but in the daytime, in full light, carrying small things in and not bringing them back out. A coffee cup, a book she'd been reading, a cardigan she wore in the evenings. He wrote that he asked her about it, and she looked at him with what he called genuine confusion, and said she didn't know what he was talking about. He checked the room. The things were there. The circle on the floor had grown. My father was not a superstitious man. He was an engineer. He believed in load-bearing mathematics and tensile strength and the irreducible logic of physical systems. And I could feel him fighting against what he was beginning to understand the way. You feel a man straining against a current in the way his muscles move. He did not call a priest. He did not call anyone. He began researching the history of the house. And what he found he did not detail extensively, except to write that the previous family had left suddenly and that the records before 1971 were incomplete in ways that felt deliberate. And he wrote the word deliberate and underlined it twice. 3 days before they left the house, he came home from work and found me in the storage room. The door was standing open. I was sitting inside the circle on the floor, cross-legged, and the scratches in the wood were around me like a frame. And I was looking at the far corner of the room where the shadows gathered and did not break up, even when he turned the flashlight directly into them. He wrote that he called my name 4 times and that I turned on the 4th time and looked at him. And he wrote that my eyes were right, that they were my eyes, that he wants to be clear about that. They were my eyes. But that there was something behind them that was using them the way a man uses a window, looking out with a patience that had no human quality to it, a patience that predated the house and predated the family and predated the street and possibly predated everything that had been built on that particular ground. He grabbed me and took me out of the room, and we left the house that night, the 3 of us with nothing except what fit in 2 bags. And he never went back, and he never told me. And my mother died the following year of a brain aneurysm in the kitchen of the apartment they'd rented while he was at work. And I was found sitting next to her body by the neighbor who came when she heard me making a noise. No one told me what noise. I was 4 years old. The journal ends there. I've read it 9 times. I keep it in my desk, not behind a false bottom, just in the drawer where I keep things I need to be able to find. I don't know what was in that corner. I don't know what my father crossed out when he described my face. I don't know what I was looking at. But I am 39 years old now, and I live alone, and I have, for the past 7 months, been waking at 3 or 4 in the morning to a sound from the room at the end of the hall. A room I use for storage, a room with no window and a door that sticks in winter. The sound is rhythmic and low. I have been telling myself it is the pipes. I had been working the night shift at the county records office for 11 years when I first noticed the error in the death certificates. It was not dramatic. It was not a chill down my spine or a sudden revelation. It was simply a number that did not belong, a date typed in a column where a different date should have been. And I set it aside the way you set aside anything that requires a second look, with the quiet intention of returning to it before the end of my shift. I did not return to it. I went home, slept 6 hours, came back, and forgot entirely that I had ever seen it. That was in February. By April, I had found 3 more. By June, I understood that something was wrong in a way I could not yet name. Something structural. Something that had been wrong for a long time before I arrived and would remain wrong long after I was gone. Though I did not know then how precisely accurate that prediction would turn out to be. The records office occupies the basement level of the municipal building on Carver Street. The floor above us houses the Water Authority and a division of the City Planning Department. The floor above that is the mayor's satellite office, which is staffed 2 days a week by a rotating assistant whose name I have never learned. We do not interact with any of them. The basement has its own entrance on the east side of the building, a metal door that faces the parking structure. And most days, I am the only person who uses it. My colleague Renata works mornings, and we overlap by 40 minutes each day. Enough time for her to brief me on anything unusual, which is almost never anything, and for me to make coffee while she gathers her coat and bag and leaves. I liked Renata. I want to say that clearly because what happened later had nothing to do with her, and I would not want anyone reading this to think otherwise. The death certificates that concerned me were all from the same cluster of years, 1989 through 1993, and they all shared a specific anomaly in the field designated for the attending physician's signature. The name recorded was not a physician's name at all, or rather, it was not the name of any physician I could locate in the State Medical Board's registry, which is public record and which I cross-referenced 3 times using different search parameters. The name was Ellard Voss. I found no medical license under that name. I found no professional listing, no obituary, no property records in the county. Nothing in the archived local newspapers I accessed through the public library's digital portal. Ellard Voss had signed 41 death certificates across 4 years and did not, as far as any record I could locate was concerned, exist. I brought this to my supervisor, Dennis, who managed the office remotely and came in person approximately once a month. He listened to me on the phone with the particular quality of silence that means a person is waiting for you to finish rather than actually listening. And when I was done, he said he would look into it. He did not look into it. I know this because I followed up twice, and both times he said he was still looking into it. And the third time, I called. His number had been reassigned to a woman who sold insurance and had never heard of Dennis or the records office or the municipal building on Carver Street. I want to be precise about my emotional state during this period because I think precision matters in an account like this. I was not frightened. I was irritated. I was a person who had spent 11 years organizing and maintaining records with a high degree of accuracy, and I had found a significant error, possibly a systemic fraud, and the person responsible for addressing such things had disappeared without so much as an out-of-office message. That was the irritating part. The 41 names on those death certificates were not irritating. They were simply a list. I had printed it out and kept it in the top drawer of my desk because I am the kind of person who prints things out when they matter. I read the list often, not out of any morbid impulse, but because I was waiting for one of the names to resolve into something meaningful, a pattern, a connection, a reason. Most of them were elderly. Several were middle-aged. 4 were children, which I noted and set aside because I did not want to think about the children more than was necessary for the work. It was in September that I noticed Renata had started leaving earlier than usual. Our 40-minute overlap shrank to 20, then to 10. And one morning I arrived to find a note on my desk saying she had already gone. No explanation. Just her name signed at the bottom in handwriting that looked more pressured than her usual script. The letters leaning hard to the right, as though pushed by something. I texted her. She replied that evening saying she had a doctor's appointment she had forgotten to mention. The next morning there was no overlap at all. The following week she called in sick. I ran the office alone for 11 days before a temporary worker named Gio was sent to cover mornings. Gio was young and spoke very little and spent most of his time on his phone. I did not brief him on the Ellard Voss certificates because they were in my desk drawer and Gio did not seem like the right audience. It was during those 11 days alone that I began hearing the sound. I hesitate to call it a sound because my first instinct was that it was not external, that it was something in my ear, a tinnitus variant, a pressure change related to the ventilation system. It occurred always in the same part of the archive room, which is the long room at the back where the physical folders are stored in gray metal shelving units that run floor to ceiling and require a rolling ladder to access the upper levels. The sound was low and rhythmic and seemed to come from behind the shelving rather than from the shelving itself, as though something behind the wall was breathing with great effort and great patience. I checked the wall. It was solid. I checked the ventilation registers. They were standard and clean. I noted the sound in a log I had started keeping because I am a person who keeps logs, and I continued doing my work. The 40-second certificate arrived on a Tuesday in October. I know it arrived because I processed it myself. The deceased was a 74-year-old man named Robert Casson. Cause of death listed as cardiac arrest. Date of death 3 days prior. The attending physician was listed as Ellard Voss. I sat with that certificate for a long time. Ellard Voss had last signed a death certificate in 1993. That was 31 years ago. If the name belonged to a real physician who had been practicing then, that physician would be very old now or dead. If the name was fraudulent, then it was fraudulent now, and someone was still using it, or using it again, which suggested either an unbroken continuity I could not account for, or something else I did not have a category for yet. I called the hospital listed on the certificate. The administrator I reached confirmed that Robert Casson had died there on the recorded date. She confirmed that his attending physician's name was on file. She would not tell me what name was on file because I was not a family member or an authorized party. I asked if the name was Ellard Voss. There was a pause that lasted several seconds longer than a simple yes or no would have required. And then she said she could not confirm or deny information about specific staff. I thanked her and ended the call and sat in the quiet of the records office and listened to the sound behind the wall, which was louder that evening than it had ever been before, and which I now understand was not a ventilation issue and was not tinnitus and was not a pressure change and was not any of the reasonable explanations I had assembled so carefully across so many weeks because I am a person who prefers reasonable explanations, and I had not yet accepted that some things present themselves to you only after the reasonable explanations have been exhausted and you are sitting alone in a basement at 9:30 at night holding a death certificate signed by a name that should not exist, listening to something behind a wall that has no business breathing. I found Renata's personnel file that same night. It took me less than 4 minutes. Her listed emergency contact was a sister in Modesto. Her employment record showed no formal resignation, no termination, no leave of absence. She had simply stopped appearing in the system after her last logged workday, as though the record of her existence in this office had been closed out quietly by someone with access and motive, and no interest in paperwork. I put the 40-second certificate in my desk drawer with a list of 41 names, and I sat there until the sound behind the wall stopped, which it did around midnight, all at once. The way a held breath is finally released. I went home. I came back the next morning. The drawer was empty. not the desk, just the drawer. Everything else was exactly as I had left it. The certificates were gone. The list was gone. My log was gone. On the surface of the desk, centered with a precision that felt deliberate, was a single sheet of paper. It was blank, except for 2 lines of text printed in the standard font used by the office system for all official documents. The first line was a name. The second line was a date. The name was mine. The date was 6 days from that morning. I am writing this on the 5th day. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling of my apartment for what must have been 20 minutes before I finally decided to write this down. I'm not sure why I feel compelled to document it. Maybe because if I don't, I'll start to believe it never happened. And I'm not sure which possibility frightens me more. My name is Daniel Marsh. I'm 34 years old. I work as a land surveyor for a private contracting firm in rural Oregon, and for the past 11 years, have prided myself on being the kind of man who deals in measurements, distances, and observable fact. What happened to me last October does not fit inside any of those categories. And it has taken me 4 months to be able to sit at a desk and type these words without my hands shaking badly enough to make it impossible. Asterisk. The job was straightforward. A timber company had acquired a tract of land about 60 miles northeast of Grants Pass, deep in the Klamath Mountains, and they needed a boundary survey completed before the logging permits could be finalized. My colleague, a man named Brett Calloway, was supposed to accompany me. But he called the morning of the 3rd to tell me his daughter had been admitted to the hospital with appendicitis. I considered postponing. The tract was remote, accessible only by a logging road that hadn't been maintained in several years. And the job would take at least 2 days. But the company was pushing hard for the permits, and my supervisor made it clear that the delay would cost us the contract. I went alone. I loaded my truck with equipment, a two-man tent, enough food for 3 days, and a satellite communicator that I tested twice in the parking lot before I left. I drove for hours, turned off the highway onto a dirt road, and drove another 90 minutes through dense second-growth timber before I reached the coordinates I'd been given as my base camp location. It was just past 1 in the afternoon. The sky was overcast but dry. I set up camp in a small clearing beside a creek, ate a sandwich, and spent the remaining daylight hours walking the eastern boundary of the tract and setting preliminary flags. Everything was normal. The forest was quiet in the way that large forests often are, with a heaviness to the air that you notice but don't think much about. I returned to camp, cooked a meal on my camp stove, and went to sleep around 9. I woke at 2:17 in the morning. I know the time because I checked my watch immediately, which is something I always do when I wake unexpectedly in the field. A habit built from years of early wake-up calls. I lay still in my sleeping bag and listened. The creek was audible, a low, steady sound that had been consistent since I arrived. But there was something else. A sound I could not immediately categorize. It was rhythmic and low, occurring at irregular intervals. Somewhere between a knock and a thud. As if something heavy were being set down on the ground repeatedly, but without any predictable pattern. I told myself it was a tree limb, stressed by wind, tapping against another tree. There was no wind. The clearing outside my tent was perfectly still when I unzipped the door and looked out. I saw nothing. The sound had stopped. I zipped the tent closed, lay back down, and did not sleep again until nearly 4. The second day was uneventful. I worked the northern and western boundaries, covered more ground than I'd expected, and by late afternoon I was confident I could finish the survey the following morning and be back on the highway before noon. The sky had cleared, and the temperature dropped sharply as the sun went behind the ridge. I made camp, built a small fire inside the ring of stones I'd assembled the previous night, and spent an hour reviewing my field notes. The forest around me was still. Unusually still, I thought, though I pushed the thought aside as the kind of vague unease that isolation sometimes manufactures. I put out the fire and went to bed at 8:30. The sound woke me again at 1:54. Same character. The irregular thudding, but louder than the night before and closer. Much closer. I lay absolutely motionless with my eyes open in the dark of the tent, and I counted the intervals between sounds. 3 seconds. 7 seconds. 2 seconds. 11 seconds. No pattern one could discern. My first coherent thought was bear, though bears don't make sounds like that. And my second thought was that I should have brought the rifle I kept in my truck and had left there because hadn't wanted to carry the extra weight. I had a folding knife in my jacket pocket. I put my jacket on inside the sleeping bag and held the knife in my fist with the blade open. The sound came again, 4 or 5 feet from the tent wall on my left side. I stopped breathing. Then nothing for a very long time. I do not know when I fell asleep again. But when I woke, it was pale gray dawn, and I could hear birds. I unzipped the tent and stepped out. The clearing looked exactly as I had left it, except for one thing. Arranged in a rough line between the tent and the tree line, spaced about 18 inches apart, were 11 stones. Each one was roughly the same size, slightly larger than a grapefruit, and each one had been placed flat side down with a kind of deliberateness that made the arrangement look intentional. They were not stones from the creek bed. The creek was 40 yards behind me. These stones were a different type of rock entirely, a dark gray that I didn't recognize from the surrounding geology. And they were dry, which meant they had not been collected from any water source nearby. I photographed them. I stood there in the cold morning air and took 12 photographs of those stones with my phone, and then I walked the perimeter of the clearing, looking for tracks. I found nothing. The duff and needles on the forest floor showed no compression that I could identify as footprints. Though I am not a tracker, and I am aware that absence of visible evidence is not the same thing as absence of presence. I finished the survey in 3 hours, working quickly, not stopping to eat. At one point, while I was taking a reading on the western boundary near a dense stand of young firs, I had the distinct and overwhelming sensation that something was standing behind me. I turned around. There was nothing there. I turned back to my instrument, and the sensation returned immediately, specific and directional. A pressure at the back of my neck that I can only describe as a tension, as the feeling of being studied. I packed my instrument, walked back to camp, broke everything down in under 30 minutes, loaded my truck, and drove out. I did not look in the rearview mirror for the first several miles, and I'm not entirely certain why. When I reached the highway, I pulled over and sat for several minutes. My hands were trembling. I called Brett from the satellite communicator and told him I'd finished the survey. He asked how it went. I told him it was fine. I did not tell him about the stones. I did not tell my supervisor or my wife or anyone for weeks. Partly because I couldn't find language for it that didn't make me sound either paranoid or melodramatic. And partly because I understood that what had disturbed me most was not the stones themselves or the sounds, but the quality of intention behind them. Whatever made those sounds was not a bear or a deer or any large mammal behaving in a way I recognized. And whatever arranged those stones did so in the hours between 2 in the morning and 6, within 30 feet of where I was sleeping, without leaving any trace I could measure or record. That gap between what I know happened and what I cannot explain is where I still live. 4 months later, and I don't expect to leave it anytime soon. I went back once. 3 weeks after the survey, on a Saturday alone, telling my wife I was doing follow-up fieldwork for the same contract. I drove back out the logging road and parked in the same clearing. The tent rings were still visible. The stones were gone. I walked the tree line slowly, looking at the ground, looking at the bark of the trees. On the third tree in from where the stones had been arranged, at a height of approximately 5.5 feet, there were marks on the bark. 4 parallel grooves, each about 8 inches long, spaced irregularly, pressed into the soft outer bark with enough force to expose the lighter wood beneath. I photographed them. I measured them. I wrote down the measurements in my field notebook, and then I walked back to my truck and drove home without stopping. The marks were not made by any animal I can identify. I've shown the photographs to 2 people, a wildlife biologist I know socially, and a friend who has spent decades hunting elk in that same mountain range. Neither of them offered me an explanation I found convincing. The biologist said possibly black bear, though the spacing was wrong and the depth was inconsistent with claw marks she had observed. My hunting friend looked at the photographs for a long time without speaking, and then handed my phone back to me and said he didn't know what made those scent, and that he didn't want to know. I understood exactly what he meant.